me! I'm calling the cops!
They will arrest you.
Do not resist.
On a street once ruled by fear, the echo of handcuffs became the final word, ending Karina's reign of control. Across the lawn, Alexander's steady calm stood in sharp contrast to her collapse, his silence louder than any accusation. This is a story about the price of arrogance and the quiet power of resolve. Like this story? Tap subscribe and share in the comments where in the world you're watching from. It had started not with a bang, but with the quiet hum of a moving truck and the rustle of expensive non-native shrubbery being planted. 6 months before the flashing lights and the satisfying click of justice, Alexander's life was a study in earned contentment. He was a man who understood the world through his hands, a former beat cop who had worked his way up through grit and integrity to the rank of police commissioner. But he wore the title like a well-worn tool belt, not a crown. He was more comfortable in jeans and a faded t-shirt, covered in sawdust, than he was in a pressed uniform behind a mahogany desk. His sanctuary was his home, a modest 2-story house he'd bought 2 decades ago, and his pride was the backyard he had transformed with his labor. The centerpiece was the pool, a cool blue oasis he had dug, plumbed, and tiled himself over 3 long, sweaty summers. It was a monument to his love for his family, his wife, Sarah, and their 2 children, 10-year-old Leo and 8-year-old Mia. The pool wasn't just a luxury, it was the heart of their home. The place where the soundtrack of their lives was the splash of a cannonball and the squeals of childish laughter. It was a place of pure, uncomplicated joy. He didn't know it yet, but that joy had an expiration date, and the clock had just started ticking. The house next door, which had sat empty for a blessedly quiet year, had finally sold. The new neighbor introduced herself not with a plate of cookies, but with a clipboard and a condescending smile. Her name was Karina, and she moved through the world as if it were a poorly managed event that she had been reluctantly called in to organize. She was all sharp angles, from her severe haircut to the aggressive points of her designer shoes that seemed to aerate the lawn with every step. Her first official act as a neighbor was to issue a series of friendly reminders about local ordinances and the Homeowners Association bylaws, a thick packet of which she hand-delivered to every house on the block. Alexander, who was staining his deck, accepted the packet with a polite nod, the smell of fresh wood and sealant, a comforting shield against her sterile, floral perfume. He noted she never made eye contact, instead letting her gaze sweep over his property, cataloguing every perceived flaw with a faint, judgmental sniff. He watched as she spoke to his wife, Sarah, her tone dripping with a kind of patronizing sweetness that was more insulting than open hostility. She pointed a long, manicured finger towards the pool. "You must be so careful with the noise levels," she'd said, her voice a silken threat. "Some of us value our peace." Sarah had come inside later, a troubled look on her face. "I have a bad feeling about her," she'd whispered. Alexander, ever the optimist, had simply shrugged. "She's just settling in," he'd said. "Let's give her a chance." It was a sentiment he would come to regret with every fiber of his being. The first official complaint came on a sweltering Saturday afternoon in July. The sun was high, the air was thick with the smell of chlorine and freshly cut grass, and the pool was a vortex of joyful chaos. Leo and Mia were engaged in a fierce Marco Polo battle, their laughter echoing off the water. Alexander was manning the grill, flipping burgers, and watching his family with a deep, bone-deep satisfaction. It was a perfect suburban tableau, the kind of memory you try to bottle up and save for a cold day. That's when he saw it. The flicker of a curtain in Karina's second-story window, a pale, watchful face peering down at them. A few minutes later, he heard the distinct, professional chirp of a police radio. A patrol car, gleaming black and white, pulled up to his curb. 2 young officers, barely older than his rookies, stepped out, their expressions a mixture of apology and duty. Alexander wiped the grease from his hands and met them at the gate, his heart sinking. He knew, with absolute certainty, who had sent them. The lead officer cleared his throat, avoiding Alexander's gaze. "Sir, we received a noise complaint," he began, gesturing vaguely towards the backyard. "Reports of a disruptive gathering." Alexander just looked at him, then back at his 2 small children splashing in the pool. A disruptive gathering, he repeated slowly, the irony thick enough to taste. The war had begun. Alexander handled the first visit with the practiced calm of a man who had spent 30 years de-escalating conflicts. He didn't flash his badge or pull rank. That wasn't his style. To these young officers, he was just Mr. Alexander from 124 Maple Drive, a middle-aged guy in a sauce-stained apron. He invited them to look into the backyard, to witness the disruptive gathering for themselves. The officers glanced past him, saw Sarah reading a book on a lounge chair and two small children playing, and their professional stiffness visibly melted away into embarrassment. "Sorry to bother you, sir," the younger one mumbled, his cheeks flushing red. The call came in as a potential out-of-control party with excessive noise. Alexander nodded, his expression unreadable. He knew the specific language was chosen to trigger a priority response. It was a calculated, malicious move. "I understand, officers. You're just doing your job," he said, his voice even. "Thank you for your professionalism." As they walked back to their car, he saw Karina's silhouette in her window again, a ghost of disapproval. He knew this was a shot across the bow. A test. She was establishing her power, letting him know that she could summon the law to her doorstep on a whim. That night, after the kids were in bed, he opened a fresh notebook and, with a heavy heart, made the first entry. July 16th, 3:15 p.m. Officers, Miller and Davis. Complaint. Out-of-control party, unfounded. He had a feeling the notebook was going to get very, very full. The next morning, while watering his hydrangeas, Alexander was approached by a stooped figure from 2 houses down. It was Mr. Henderson, a retired history teacher in his late 70s, who had lived on the street since the houses were first built. He moved with the slow, deliberate pace of a man who had seen it all and was in no hurry to see it again. "Morning, Alex," he said, his voice a gravelly whisper. He leaned on the handle of his rake, his eyes twinkling with a sad sort of wisdom as he nodded towards Karina's pristine, lifeless yard. "Saw you had some visitors in blue yesterday." Alexander gave a wry smile. "Just a misunderstanding." Mr. Henderson shook his head slowly. "With her," he said, his voice dropping lower. "There are no misunderstandings, only campaigns." He went on to tell Alexander about the Prestons, the family who had lived there before Karina. They were a young couple with a new baby. Their dog, a friendly golden retriever, had barked a few times at a squirrel. Karina, who had only been in the neighborhood for a week at that point as a prospective buyer, had filed 3 separate animal control complaints and threatened a lawsuit before her purchase had even closed. The Prestons, exhausted and intimidated, had sold the house to her at a loss just to escape the relentless harassment. "She's a bully, Alex," Mr. Henderson concluded, his gaze serious. "She uses rules and regulations like a cudgel. Don't underestimate her. She doesn't want peace. She wants surrender." Mr. Henderson's warning proved prophetic. The calls became a regular feature of their lives, a toxic rhythm set by Karina's whims. The complaints grew increasingly absurd, each one a masterpiece of petty fiction. One evening, a call about blinding, unpermitted floodlights brought a cruiser to their door. The officer was met with the sight of 2 strings of soft, solar-powered fairy lights Sarah had hung around the patio. Another time, the fire department was dispatched for an uncontrolled bonfire, only to find Alexander's small, covered fire pit where he and the kids were roasting marshmallows. The smell of their barbecue was reported as a noxious chemical odor. The gentle lapping of the pool's filter was described as deafening industrial machinery. With each call, Alexander remained polite and calm to the responding officers. He knew their frustration was growing. They were being used as a weapon in a neighborly dispute. Their time and city resources squandered on Karina's vendettas. He continued to log every single incident in his notebook, the pages filling with a damning chronicle of harassment. The worst part was the effect it was having on his family. Mia started asking if they could play inside. Her natural ebullience dimmed. Leo began looking over his shoulder towards Karina's house whenever he made a splash. The pool, once a symbol of joy, was slowly becoming a source of anxiety. Alexander's quiet contentment was curdling into a cold, simmering rage. He was a man of the law, and the law was being twisted into a tool of oppression against his own family. The breaking point, the moment Alexander knew he had to move from defense to offense, came not with a police car, but with a certified letter from the Homeowners Association. Karina, through her sheer force of will and manipulation of procedural rules at a poorly attended meeting, had gotten herself elected HOA president. The letter was a formal citation. It stated that their pool, the one he had built with his own 2 hands and which had passed every city inspection with flying colors, violated a newly minted bylaw. The bylaw, retroactive and aimed at him, stipulated that all in-ground pools must be surrounded by a sound-dampening, non-reflective privacy fence of no less than 8 feet in height. The citation came with a fine of $100 per day until they complied. It was a declaration of total war. He looked at the letter, at Karina's flamboyant, self-important signature at the bottom, and felt something shift inside him. The patient, reasonable man was receding, and the seasoned, strategic police commissioner was taking his place. This was no longer about a noisy pool. This was about the abuse of power, about a petty tyrant creating her laws to persecute a citizen. He picked up his phone, not to call 911, but to call an old friend. "Frank," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "It's Alex. I need you to do a deep dive on someone for me. Off the books. Her name is Karina Adler." Frank Miller, his most trusted detective, simply replied, "Consider it done, boss." Detective Frank Miller was the kind of cop who seemed to run on stale coffee and pure, unadulterated cynicism. He was a bloodhound in a rumpled suit, and he lived for the hunt. When his commissioner and old friend called him with a personal request, Miller knew it was serious. Alexander wasn't the type to mix business with his private life. Miller started digging into Karina Adler, and what he found was a trail of scorched earth that stretched across 3 different states. In her previous neighborhood in Arizona, she had bankrupted a family by suing them over the shade cast by their 100-year-old oak tree. In a condo association in Florida, she had managed to get an elderly woman's therapy dog removed by citing a no pets clause that had been defunct for years. Her pattern was always the same: gain a position of minor authority, weaponize the bylaws, and harass anyone who didn't bow to her will. She was a professional victim and a serial abuser of systems. But Miller found something more. He cross-referenced the HOA's financial records, which Alexander had requested as a homeowner. A pattern emerged. The new sound-dampening fence she was demanding had to be sourced from one specific, absurdly overpriced company: Serenescapes Landscaping. A little more digging revealed that Serenescapes Landscaping was a shell corporation, and the sole owner was listed as K.A. The sole proprietor of K.A. Holdings, Karina Adler herself. It wasn't just harassment anymore. It was fraud. Alexander sat at his kitchen table late one night, the file from Detective Miller spread out before him. The smell of old coffee filled the air as he read through the evidence. It was all there. The history of vexatious litigation, the affidavits from her past victims Miller had tracked down, and the damning paper trail of the financial fraud. She wasn't just a Karen, she was a criminal. He felt a cold clarity settle over him. This was familiar territory. He had spent his career building cases like this, piece by methodical piece, until they were airtight. The anger he felt was no longer hot and reactive. It was cold, focused, and purposeful. He was no longer just a father protecting his family. He was a commissioner preparing to uphold the law. His specific expertise, his intimate knowledge of procedure, evidence, and the inner workings of the justice system, was now his greatest weapon. He began to map out a strategy, a chess game where every move was calculated. He knew he couldn't just present the evidence. That would be messy, and it would allow her to play the victim. No, he needed to catch her in the act. He needed an event so undeniable, so publicly flagrant, that her entire facade would shatter in an instant. He looked out the window at the quiet, dark water of his pool, illuminated by the soft glow of the moon. The instrument of his persecution would now become the stage for her downfall. The next step was to galvanize the community. Alexander knew from Mr. Henderson and his observations that he wasn't Karina's only target. He was just the one who was fighting back. He spent the next week talking to his neighbors, not as a police commissioner, but as a fellow homeowner. He started with the Johnsons, the young couple who had received a series of escalating fines for the basketball hoop their son loved. He showed them the HOA bylaws, pointing out the clause that explicitly permitted such equipment. Then he went to the Garcias, who had been ordered to remove a tasteful, professionally installed garden shed because it was, according to Karina, not in keeping with the neighborhood's aesthetic. He methodically dismantled her authority, not with threats, but with facts. He explained her financial self-dealing, showing them the proof of her connection to Serenescape's landscaping. Fear slowly gave way to anger. People who had been isolated and intimidated found strength in numbers. They realized they weren't alone. One by one, they agreed to provide their own documented accounts of Karina's harassment and financial malfeasance to Detective Miller. A quiet suburban street was transforming into a coalition of the wronged, a silent army waiting for their general to give the signal. The rallied community was now a real, tangible force. They were ready. With the community's support solidified and a mountain of evidence compiled, Alexander moved to the next phase of his plan, enlisting his professional allies. He arranged a discreet, off-site meeting with the city attorney, a sharp, no-nonsense lawyer named Maria Flores, and Detective Miller. In a sterile conference room far from City Hall, he laid out the entire case. He presented his logbook of false police reports, the financial documents proving Karina's fraud, and the signed affidavits from a dozen other victimized neighbors. Maria Flores listened intently, her fingers steepled, her expression growing more severe with each document she reviewed. "This is astounding," she said, shaking her head. "The sheer audacity. She's running a criminal enterprise disguised as an HOA." Miller chimed in. "The misuse of emergency services alone is a serious offense. We've calculated she's diverted over 40 hours of patrol time with her bogus calls in the last 2 months." Alexander looked at them both. "I need this to be perfect," he said. "When we move, it has to be decisive and legally unshakable. I want her caught red-handed." The three of them began to craft the final act. They would use Karina's obsessive behavior against her. They decided to set a trap, a stage play so convincing that she would have no choice but to make the one final, fatal call that would seal her fate. The plan was as meticulous and detailed as a military operation. The day of the operation, which Alexander privately called Operation Splashdown, dawned bright and clear. The air was filled with a nervous energy that only he, Sarah, and a few key people were aware of. He had briefed the patrol shift commander and the 911 dispatch supervisor that morning. He told them to expect a specific type of call from a specific address and gave them precise instructions on how to handle it. The responding officers were to be a hand-picked veteran sergeant and his partner, men Alexander trusted implicitly. They were instructed to approach the scene with caution, as per the expected report, but to observe and report the reality of the situation accurately over the radio, ensuring their transmission could be heard by anyone nearby with a scanner, or by, say, a nosy neighbor standing on her porch. Sarah, his partner in all things, helped set the stage. They brought out a small portable fire pit, a bag of marshmallows, and some graham crackers. The kids, Leo and Mia, were told they were having a special weeknight campfire. They were blissfully unaware of the drama about to unfold, their genuine happy chatter providing the perfect cover. As dusk began to settle, casting long shadows across the lawn, Alexander sat in a patio chair, a roasting stick in his hand, and waited. He could feel Karina's eyes on them from her window. The curtain was drawn, but he knew she was there. Watching, waiting, seething. The trap was set. Now, all they needed was for the mouse to take the bait. The 911 call came in at exactly 8:42 p.m. The dispatcher, who had been briefed by Alexander, handled it with professional poise, her voice betraying none of the script she was following. On the other end of the line, Karina's voice was a high-pitched symphony of fabricated panic. "There's a massive party at 124 Maple Drive," she shrieked, her words tumoring over each other. "It's out of control. There are teenagers everywhere. I think they're drinking. I saw them exchanging things. It looks like drugs. You have to get here now before someone gets hurt." Every word was a lie. carefully chosen to escalate the police response from a simple noise complaint to a top priority public safety issue. It was a felony to file such a report. In the dispatch center, the supervisor gave a quiet nod. The call was being recorded, every perjurious syllable captured. 2 miles away, Sergeant Reynolds and his partner, Officer Chen, who had been waiting in a nearby parking lot, received the call. All units be advised. Report of a 415/narcotics activity in progress at 124 Maple. Multiple juveniles, alcohol, and possible drug sales. Sergeant Reynolds keyed his mic. 10-4, dispatch. We're en route. They did not activate their sirens. They did not activate their flashing lights. They proceeded towards Maple Drive with a quiet, deliberate speed. They were the closing jaws of a trap that had been weeks in the making. Alexander, hearing the distant, faint sound of an engine, knew the final act was about to begin. Karina stood on her porch, arms crossed, a triumphant smirk gracing her lips. She watched the 2 patrol cars glide silently to the curb in front of Alexander's house. This was it, the grand finale, the public humiliation she had been craving. She had seen the police cars arrive without lights and sirens, which she took as a sign of a tactical approach, proof of how seriously they were taking her report. The officers got out, their faces grim and set, their hands hovering near their equipment. They moved with purpose towards Alexander's front gate. She could already picture it. The police breaking up the wild party, lecturing Alexander on his parental negligence, perhaps even hauling him away. The sweet, sweet validation. She imagined the other neighbors peeking through their curtains, witnessing her victory. From her vantage point, she couldn't see the tranquil family scene in the backyard, only the dark shapes of the officers moving into the property. She strained her ears, waiting for the shouting, the chaos, the sounds of her authority being enforced. Instead, there was only a confusing, anticlimactic silence, punctuated by the gentle chirping of crickets. What was taking so long? Her smirk began to falter, replaced by a flicker of impatient annoyance. This wasn't going according to her script at all. Sergeant Reynolds and Officer Chen walked through the side gate, which Alexander had purposefully left unlatched. They stepped into the backyard, and the scene that greeted them was exactly as the commissioner had described. A man and a woman sat in patio chairs around a small, crackling fire pit. 2 children were laughing as they tried to construct the perfect s'more, their faces sticky with chocolate. Soft music played from a small Bluetooth speaker at a volume that was barely audible from the gate. The air smelled of wood smoke and toasted sugar. It was the antithesis of a wild, drug-fueled teenage rager. Sergeant Reynolds unclipped his radio from his shoulder. He took a deliberate step back towards the side yard, ensuring his transmission would carry towards Karina's house. He pressed the button and spoke, his voice calm, clear, and loud. Dispatch, be advised. We are on scene at 124 Maple. The report of a large party is completely unfounded. I repeat, unfounded. The scene is a quiet family gathering. There are 2 adults and 2 children present. No signs of alcohol, no narcotics, no disturbance of any kind. He paused for a beat, letting the words hang in the night air. Dispatch, please confirm the identity of the reporting party. We're going to need to have a word with them about filing a false report. Over on her porch, Karina heard every word. The blood drained from her face. The sergeant's radio broadcast was a dagger to the heart of Karina's narrative. Her smug satisfaction instantly evaporated, replaced by a cold, creeping dread. Unfounded. A quiet family gathering. It was impossible. She had willed a crisis into existence, and these incompetent officers were refusing to see it. Enraged, she stormed off her porch and marched across her perfectly manicured lawn, her heels digging into the soft turf. What is the meaning of this? She demanded, her voice shrill as she arrived at Alexander's gate, where Sergeant Reynolds was now standing. I called you. There was a party. They must have hidden everything when they heard you coming. You have to search the premises. Arrest them. She pointed an accusing, trembling finger at Alexander, who was now slowly walking towards them from the backyard. His expression one of profound, weary calm. Sergeant Reynolds turned to face her, his face an unreadable mask of professional detachment. Ma'am, we've assessed the situation. There is no evidence of any party or any illegal activity. "You're not listening to me," she shrieked, her voice cracking with hysteria. "I am the president of the Homeowners Association. I am a concerned citizen. He is a public menace." It was at that moment that Alexander finally spoke. His voice was quiet, yet it cut through her tirade like a surgeon's scalpel. "Sergeant," he said, "I believe that's enough." Alexander gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod to Sergeant Reynolds. Then, he turned his full attention to Karina. The transformation was subtle, but total. The friendly barbecue-hosting neighbor disappeared, and in his place stood the police commissioner. His posture straightened, his gaze sharpened, and an aura of quiet, unshakable authority settled over him. "Karina," he began, his tone even and devoid of emotion. "For the past 6 months, you have engaged in a systematic campaign of harassment against my family. You have knowingly and repeatedly misused emergency services, diverting critical resources away from actual crises. Tonight, you escalated your campaign by filing a malicious and provably false felony police report." Karina's jaw worked, but no sound came out. Her mind was scrambling, trying to process what was happening. He wasn't cowering. He wasn't apologizing. He was accusing her. Alexander pulled out his phone and pressed a number on his speed dial. He held it to his ear for a moment. "Detective Miller," he said. "Undone one, we're ready." A moment later, a dark, unmarked sedan that had been parked down the street pulled up behind the patrol cars. Detective Miller, looking grimly satisfied in his rumpled suit, stepped out, holding a thick file. Karina stared, her eyes wide with confusion and a dawning horror. This was not how her victory was supposed to look. Detective Miller walked up and stood beside Alexander, a silent, imposing presence. He opened the file. "Karina Adler," he said, his voice flat and official, "you are being placed under arrest." Karina let out a short, hysterical laugh. "Arrest me? For what? For being a vigilant neighbor? This is insane. This is harassment." Miller's eyes were cold. "You are being arrested for filing a false police report, a felony under State Penal Code 148.5. He then looked down at his file. "You are also being charged with multiple counts of wire fraud, embezzlement, and racketeering in connection with your activities as president of the Maple Drive Homeowners Association." He held up a document from the file. It was the incorporation paper for Serene Scapes Landscaping, with her name visible as the sole owner. Karina stared at the paper as if it were a venomous snake. The color drained from her face, leaving a pasty gray pallor beneath her expensive foundation. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Fraud? Embezzlement? These were things that happened to other people, to common criminals, not to her. "This is a mistake," she stammered, her voice a weak whisper. "You have no proof." Alexander finally allowed himself a small, grim smile. "Oh, we have proof, Karina," he said softly. "We have all the proof in the world, and it was you who delivered the final piece of evidence tonight, gift-wrapped." Sergeant Reynolds stepped forward, a pair of shiny steel handcuffs in his hand. The reality of the situation finally crashed down on Karina with the force of a physical blow. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was the end. Her carefully constructed world of power and control was disintegrating before her very eyes. "No," she pleaded, her voice losing its shrill anger and taking on a pathetic, desperate tone. "You can't do this. I am a respected member of this community. I know people." She looked wildly from the sergeant to Miller, to the other neighbors who were now emerging from their homes, drawn by the commotion. She saw no support in their faces, but a quiet, collective satisfaction. She saw Mr. Henderson standing on his porch, giving a slow, deliberate nod. She saw the Johnsons, the Garcias, and a dozen other families she had terrorized, all watching her downfall in silence. Her final, desperate gaze landed on Alexander. He simply stood there, a silent judge, his face unreadable. "Please," she whispered, the fight finally gone out of her. Sergeant Reynolds took her arm gently but firmly. "Ma'am, you need to put your hands behind your back." The sharp, metallic click of the handcuffs, locking around her wrists, echoed in the stunned silence of the street. It was the sound of justice, a sound the residents of Maple Drive had been waiting a very long time to hear. The aftermath was both swift and profoundly satisfying. Karina's arrest was the talk of the town, a cautionary tale of suburban tyranny brought to heel. With the mountain of evidence Alexander and Miller had compiled, the district attorney's case was airtight. Karina's high-priced lawyer attempted to paint her as a misunderstood, overzealous community advocate, but the jury saw through the charade. The testimonies from her past and present victims, combined with the irrefutable financial documents and the recording of her final, hysterical 911 call, sealed her fate. She was convicted on all counts: felony, false reporting, wire fraud, and embezzlement. The judge, citing her complete lack of remorse and the malicious, calculated nature of her crimes, sentenced her to 3 years in state prison. It was a sentence that sent a clear message. The law is not a personal weapon, and positions of community trust are not to be exploited for personal gain. The news of her conviction spread through the neighborhood like a fresh spring breeze, clearing away the toxic atmosphere that had lingered for far too long. There was a sense of collective relief, of a heavy weight being lifted from everyone's shoulders. The reign of the petty tyrant of Maple Drive was officially and finally over. With Karina gone, the Maple Drive Homeowners Association underwent a radical transformation. Alexander, wanting no part of the leadership but feeling a responsibility to see the repair through, helped facilitate a series of community meetings. The residents, once cowed and divided, were now engaged and united. They voted to dissolve the old, convoluted book of bylaws Karina had weaponized and drafted a new, simpler charter based on common sense and mutual respect. The new HOA was a tool for community betterment, not a cudgel for personal vendettas. They organized neighborhood cleanup days, a block party, and a community garden on a neglected common space. The oppressive silence that Karina had enforced was replaced by the sounds of a living, breathing community. Kids playing basketball, neighbors chatting over fences, the sound of music and laughter drifting from backyard barbecues. Mr. Henderson remarked to Alexander one afternoon that the neighborhood felt more like itself than it had in years. The oppressive cloud of scrutiny was gone, and people were no longer afraid of a certified letter appearing in their mailbox for a minor infraction. They were free to simply be neighbors again, and the change was palpable in the very air of the street. As for Alexander and his family, the peace they reclaimed was immeasurable. The pool, once the battlefield of a psychological war, was restored to its rightful place as the heart of their home. The sounds of splashing and laughter returned, louder and more joyful than ever before. Leo and Mia no longer looked over their shoulders when they played, their childhood innocence no longer tainted by a neighbor's malice. Sarah could read by the pool without a knot of anxiety in her stomach. Alexander found that the simple act of sitting in his backyard, listening to the happy sounds of his family, was a pleasure more profound than he had ever realized. He had never wanted to bring his work home, to use his position as a weapon. But when his sanctuary was threatened, when a bully used the very systems he swore to uphold as tools of oppression, he had been left with no choice. He had fought back, not with anger, but with strategy, not with force, but with facts. He had used the law not to punish, but to restore balance. He looked at the calm, shimmering blue water, a monument he had built with his own hands, and felt a deep, abiding sense of justice. He had protected his family, his home, and his community, and the peace was finally, truly, won. The following summer, the neighborhood held its first annual Maple Drive block party. The street was closed to traffic, and tables laden with food stretched from one end to the other. Music played, kids drew on the pavement with chalk, and neighbors who had once only exchanged wary nods were now laughing and sharing stories. Alexander was manning a large grill, flipping burgers for a long line of hungry residents. Mr. Henderson sat in a lawn chair in the shade, holding court with a group of older residents, all of them smiling. Detective Miller had even stopped by with his family, grabbing a burger and clapping Alexander on the shoulder. "Quite a different scene from last year, huh, boss?" he said with a grin. Alexander looked around at the vibrant, happy scene, at the tangible evidence of a community reborn. He saw the Johnson kid perfecting his three-point shot at his basketball hoop, which now stood proudly at the end of his driveway. He saw the Garcia family showing off pictures of their new, beautifully organized shed. It was more than just a party. It was a celebration of their collective victory over pettiness and control. It was a testament to the fact that when good people stand together, no tyrant, no matter how determined, can stand against them. That evening, after the last of the party guests had gone home and the street was quiet again, Alexander sat by his pool. The solar-powered fairy lights that Sarah had hung, the ones that had been the subject of an official complaint, now cast a soft, magical glow over the patio. The water was still, reflecting the stars that were beginning to pepper the darkening sky. He thought about the long, stressful journey of the past year. He had been pushed, tested, and forced to become a warrior in his backyard. He had learned that sometimes the most important battles are not fought in the streets or courtrooms, but over property lines and fence heights. They are battles for the right to live peacefully, to enjoy the fruits of your labor, and to raise your family without fear and intimidation. He had won, but the victory wasn't just his. It belonged to every neighbor who had found the courage to speak up, to every officer who had patiently responded to a ridiculous call, and to a legal system that, when guided by truth, could deliver true justice. The fight had been righteous, the outcome vindictive in the purest sense of the word, a deserved and just punishment for wrongdoing. And the result? It was inspirational. It was a reminder that one person, armed with patience, principles, and a meticulously kept notebook, could indeed stand up to a bully and win. He thought back to the flash-forward hook of his own life, that cinematic moment of Karina's arrest. It felt like a scene from a movie, a tidy resolution to a dramatic conflict. But real life is often messier. The epilogue, the slow and steady work of rebuilding and healing, was the true story. It was in the quiet conversations between neighbors, the shared tools, the friendly waves. It was in the absence of certified letters and the presence of potluck invitations. Justice wasn't just the click of handcuffs. It was the sound of children laughing freely in a backyard pool on a warm summer evening. It was the restoration of normalcy, the reclaiming of peace. Alexander had not set out to be a hero or a community leader. He was just a man who wanted to protect his home. But in doing so, he had reminded an entire neighborhood of the power of solidarity and the importance of standing up for what is right, even when it's hard. He had faced down the petty tyrant, not by lowering himself to her level, but by rising above, using the very system she sought to abuse as an instrument of perfect, inescapable justice. It was a lesson he hoped he would never have to teach again, but one he knew he and his neighbors would never forget. The story of Karina and the pool became a local legend, a kind of suburban folktale told at neighborhood barbecues. New families who moved onto the street would hear it from the older residents. A story about the time the quiet man at 124 Maple, the guy who was always working on some project in his yard, took on the HOA dragon and won. It served as a powerful inoculation against any future Karens who might consider trying to impose their will on the community. The new HOA charter, with its emphasis on transparency and simple, common-sense rules, ensured that power could never again be consolidated in the hands of a single, malicious individual. The HOA's finances were posted online for all to see, and contracts for services were put to a community vote. The structure that Karina had built for her enrichment was dismantled and rebuilt to serve its true purpose, the betterment of the community as a whole. The positive changes were not just procedural, they were cultural. People were kinder, more tolerant, and quicker to help one another out, bonded by their shared experience of having survived and overcome a common enemy. The conflict had, ironically, made them a stronger and more cohesive neighborhood than ever before. Years later, when Leo and Mia were in high school, they were sitting with their dad by the pool one afternoon. Leo, now a tall, lanky teenager, was recounting the story he'd heard from a friend whose family had just moved in. "They were telling me about the crazy HOA lady who got arrested, Dad," he said, a grin on his face. "They said the guy who took her down was some kind of super cop. They had no idea it was you." Alexander smiled. He rarely spoke of it. The victory was not something he needed to boast about. The peaceful, happy neighborhood was victory enough. Mia, ever the more thoughtful of the two, looked at the pool, its water sparkling in the sun. "I remember being scared to make a splash," she said quietly. "I remember feeling like we were always being watched." Alexander put his arm around her. "You never have to feel that way again," he said, his voice firm with the conviction of a promise he knew he could keep. "This is our home, This is our sanctuary, and no one will ever take that away from us. The pool was more than just concrete and water. It was a symbol of their resilience, a testament to a battle fought and won, a place where the only sounds were now the sounds of joy, forever undisturbed. The lessons Alexander learned during that tumultuous year stayed with him, shaping his perspective both as a man and as a police commissioner. He became even more attuned to how systems and bureaucracies could be exploited by those with malicious intent. He spearheaded a new initiative within his department to train officers on how to better identify and handle vexatious complainants, individuals who repeatedly use police or municipal services to harass others. The program helped save countless hours of police time and protected innocent citizens from being targeted by neighbors like Karina. He also volunteered his time to advise other community associations on how to draft fair and transparent bylaws, using the Maple Drive Charter as a model. He turned a personal, painful experience into a positive force for change that extended far beyond his property line. He understood that the world was full of petty tyrants, large and small, who thrive on intimidation and the manipulation of rules. But he also understood, more deeply than ever, that their power was an illusion, one that could be shattered by courage, unity, and the simple, unwavering application of the truth. His fight was over, but his mission to protect and serve had taken on a new, more personal, and perhaps even more meaningful dimension. Karina was eventually released from prison, a quieter, more subdued version of her former self. She did not return to Maple Drive. The house was sold, and a new, friendly family moved in, adding to the restored harmony of the street. Occasionally, Alexander would hear whispers about her. She was living in a different state, in a small apartment, her wealth and reputation gone. She had lost everything, not because of one man's vendetta, but because of her arrogance. Her need for control had led her to a place where she had no control at all. There was a profound and satisfying irony in her fate. She had tried to destroy a man's peaceful enjoyment of his property, and in the end, she had lost her own. She had used the law as a weapon, and the law had turned on her with implacable force. Alexander felt no lingering hatred for her, only a kind of distant pity. She was a hollow person, whose only sense of self-worth came from dominating others. Her downfall was not just a legal consequence. It was the inevitable result of a life lived without empathy, kindness, or respect for the simple rights of others. Her story served as a permanent, silent reminder to everyone on Maple Drive. Be a good neighbor, because the consequences of being a bad one can be truly, devastatingly absolute. One late autumn evening, long after the pool had been closed for the season, Alexander was in his garage, working on an old wooden chair he was restoring. The smell of sawdust and varnish filled the air. Mr. Henderson shuffled in, holding 2 bottles of beer. "Figured you could use a break," the old man said, handing him a cold one. They sat for a while in comfortable silence, watching the last light of day fade outside. "You know," Mr. Henderson said finally, "what you did. It wasn't just about a noisy pool or a crazy neighbor. You reminded people that they have a voice. You showed them they don't have to just sit back and take it." Alexander took a long sip of his beer. "I just did what anyone would do to protect their family." Mr. Henderson shook his head. "No, Alex. Not everyone. Most people are afraid. They're afraid of the hassle, the legal fees, the confrontation. You took it all on. You were our lightning rod." He looked at Alexander, his old eyes clear and sincere. "You made this a neighborhood again. Don't ever think that was a small thing." Alexander looked out at the quiet street, at the warm lights glowing in his neighbor's windows, and he understood. The fight had been personal, but the peace was communal. And that was a victory worth celebrating, even in the quiet of a dusty garage with an old friend. The legacy of Operation Splashdown was not one of vengeance, but of empowerment. The residents of Maple Drive were no longer passive observers in their community. They were active participants, invested in its well-being. The HOA meetings, which Karina used to dominate with an iron fist, were now well-attended. Collaborative events, debates were civil, decisions were democratic, and the focus was always on what was best for the community as a whole. The experience had forged a bond between the neighbors, a sense of shared history and collective strength. They had faced down a common adversary, and emerged stronger and more united. They looked out for one another, not because a bylaw told them to, but because they genuinely cared. The street was more than just a collection of houses. It was a community, in the truest sense of the word. Alexander, the reluctant general of their suburban war, had shown them the way. He had proven that one person's principled stand could inspire a quiet revolution, transforming a neighborhood ruled by fear into one governed by friendship and mutual respect. The quiet ripple effects of his actions had created a tidal wave of positive change that would be felt for generations to come. Alexander never had to use his authority as police commissioner in his personal life again. The incident with Karina was a singular event, a perfect storm of provocation and principle. He continued his career with the same quiet integrity that had defined his life, earning the respect of his officers and the citizens he served. But the memory of that fight remained a private touchstone for him, a reminder of the fine line between order and tyranny, between rules that serve people and people who serve rules. He understood that true authority came not from a badge or a title, but from moral conviction and the respect of one's peers. He had won the battle for Maple Drive not because he was the police commissioner, but because he was a good man who had been pushed too far. His greatest weapon had not been the power of his office, but the strength of his character. And as he watched his children grow up in the peaceful, happy home he had fought to protect, he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his soul, that it had been a fight worth having. The peace was real, the joy was genuine, and the pool in his backyard remained a sparkling blue symbol of a hard-won and deeply cherished victory. The story spread through the law enforcement community as well, a what-would-you-do scenario discussed in break rooms and training academies. Alexander's meticulous documentation, his strategic patience, and his ultimate, decisive action became a case study in how to handle systematic harassment when you yourself are the target. He had demonstrated a masterclass in emotional control, never once losing his temper or acting unprofessionally, even as the provocation escalated. He had trusted the system, even when it was being used against him, and had methodically built a legally impenetrable case. He showed that the best way to defeat a bully who weaponizes the rules is to know the rules better and to apply them with surgical precision. Younger officers learned from his example that true power wasn't about intimidation or shows of force. It was about the quiet, relentless pursuit of justice. His reputation, already solid, was burnished with a new layer of respect. He was not just a boss. He was a leader who had faced a personal crucible and emerged not only victorious, but with his principles intact and his integrity unblemished. He had turned a personal nightmare into a professional teaching moment for an entire generation of cops. Years passed. The trees on Maple Drive grew taller, casting longer, more comforting shadows. Children who had been toddlers during Karina's reign were now teenagers, with no memory of the oppressive quiet that had once defined their street. The block parties continued, a beloved annual tradition. Mr. Henderson eventually sold his house and moved to a retirement community, but not before a heartfelt farewell party where he once again toasted Alexander as the man who gave us our neighborhood back. The Garcias' shed won a prize in a local gardening magazine. The Johnson kid, his jump shot perfected, earned a basketball scholarship to a state university. Life moved on, as it always does. The ripples of the past slowly smoothing out into the calm surface of the present. But the foundation of the community remained strong, forged in the fires of that shared conflict. The story was a part of the street's DNA now, a reminder of the time they had all stood together. It was a legacy of resilience, a quiet monument to the idea that a community is not just a place, but a collective agreement to look out for one another, to protect the peace, and to never, ever let a bully win. One day, Alexander received a letter. It was postmarked from a small, unfamiliar town several states away. The handwriting on the envelope was cramped and spidery. He opened it with a sense of curiosity. It was from Karina. The letter was not an apology, not in the true sense of the word. It was rambling and self-pitying, full of justifications for her past behavior. But in one small, almost hidden paragraph, there was a flicker of something else. "I don't understand people like you," she wrote. "You had all the power, and you never used it until the very end. I thought you were weak. I see now that I was the weak one." It was the closest she would ever come to admitting fault. Alexander read the letter, folded it, and put it away. He felt no triumph, no desire to gloat. He just felt a sense of closure. She had finally, in her broken way, understood. His power wasn't in his title, it was in his restraint. He had won not by being the strongest, but by being the most patient. Her campaign of noise and intimidation had been defeated by his quiet resolve. It was a fitting, final postscript to the long, strange saga of the war for Maple Drive. The battle was long over, and every echo of it had finally faded away into a well-deserved silence. Alexander retired a few years later, trading his commissioner's desk for his workshop permanently. His days were filled with the satisfying rhythms of sanding wood, turning wrenches, and tending to his garden. He and Sarah traveled, but they were always happy to return to the sanctuary of their home on Maple Drive. The neighborhood remained a peaceful, friendly enclave, a testament to the stand they had all taken years ago. Sometimes, on a hot summer day, he would sit by the pool, watching his grandchildren Leo's kids splash and play in the same water where so much drama had unfolded. He would think about how easily it all could have gone a different way. If he had given in, if he had built the fence, if he had sold the house, the cancer of Karina's personality would have spread, and the neighborhood would have been lost. But he had held the line. He had endured the harassment, the stress, and the sleepless nights. All for this. For the simple, priceless sound of his family's laughter, echoing freely in the warm summer air, with no fear of a neighbor's wrath or a baseless police complaint. It was the sound of victory. It was the sound of peace. And it was sweeter than he could have ever imagined. The legacy of the incident extended beyond just the neighborhood. The city council, prompted by advocacy from Alexander and city attorney Maria Flores, passed a new ordinance nicknamed the Neighbors' Peace Act. It streamlined the process for citizens to file official harassment complaints against individuals who repeatedly made frivolous 911 calls or abused. Municipal code enforcement for personal vendettas. The ordinance established a clear 3 strikes policy, where a third verified unfounded complaint from the same individual would trigger an automatic investigation and significant fines. It gave teeth to the law and provided a clear pathway for victims of systematic harassment to seek relief without having to resort to expensive civil litigation. The story of Karina Adler, though her name was never used in the official documents, became the catalyst for a meaningful change that protected thousands of citizens across the city. Alexander's battle had resulted in a public good, a shield for countless others who might have found themselves in a similar situation. His methodical, righteous stand had not only saved his peace of mind, but had also fortified the peace of the entire city he had sworn to protect. It was a fitting capstone to a long and distinguished career in public service. The tale of Alexander and Karina became a sort of internal benchmark within the police department. Recruits would hear it from their training officers as an example of the strange and unpredictable nature of police work. It illustrated how a seemingly minor suburban dispute could escalate into a serious criminal investigation. It taught the importance of detailed report writing, as the officers' consistent, unfounded notes on Karina's calls had formed the bedrock of the harassment case. It also taught a more subtle lesson about perspective. The officers who had responded to Karina's calls initially saw Alexander as a potential perpetrator, the subject of a complaint. They learned that the person making the call is not always the victim. The incident forced a shift in thinking, encouraging officers to look at the totality of the circumstances, to recognize patterns of abuse, and to understand that the misuse of their authority was a serious offense in itself. The quiet commissioner had, without ever intending to, created a powerful, real-world training scenario that would make his officers wiser, more discerning, and more effective protectors of their community for years to come. The lessons learned on Maple Drive were now being applied citywide, making everyone safer. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place about a year after Karina's conviction. The new HOA board, conducting a thorough audit, discovered the true extent of her financial crimes. It wasn't just directing contracts to her own shell company. She had been systematically embezzling funds for years, creating fake invoices for community maintenance that never occurred and pocketing the money. The total amount stolen was well over $100,000. This new evidence was turned over to the district attorney, and additional charges were filed against her while she was already incarcerated. Her sentence was extended, and a lien was placed on the sale of her house to pay back every cent she had stolen from the community. It was the final nail in her coffin, a definitive statement that her reign of terror was not only over, but would be fully rectified. The recovered money was used to build a beautiful new playground in the neighborhood's common area, a project Karina had always vetoed. The playground, with its bright swings and happy children, became a vibrant and living symbol of the community's triumph. It was a place of joy built directly from the ashes of a tyrant's greed, a final, ironic twist in a long and bitter fight. Alexander's story is a powerful reminder that the archetype of the blue-collar everyman is not about the specific job, but about a mindset. It's about a person with practical skills, a strong moral compass, and a deep-seated belief in fairness. Alexander, though the police commissioner, was at his core a man who believed in building things, whether it was a backyard pool or a criminal case. He approached the problem with Karina, not as a high-ranking official pulling strings, but as a meticulous craftsman, laying a foundation, brick by evidentiary brick, until the structure was sound and unassailable. His specific expertise was in the law, but his motivation was the universal desire of every person to be left in peace in their own home. He demonstrated that true strength isn't about shouting the loudest or wielding the most obvious power. It's about quiet determination, strategic thinking, and the unwavering conviction that right will, in the end, prevail over wrong. He was a David who just happened to have the strategic mind of a Goliath, and he used it to defend not just his castle, but the entire village. The supporting cast in this suburban drama each played their crucial role. Mr. Henderson, the wise elder, was the catalyst, the one who first armed Alexander with the crucial knowledge that he was not dealing with a reasonable person. His warning transformed Alexander's perspective from one of hopeful tolerance to one of cautious vigilance. Detective Miller, the professional ally, was the indispensable partner, the one who turned Alexander's logbook into a mountain of prosecutable evidence. He was the force multiplier, bringing the full investigative resources of the police department to bear on the problem. And finally, the rallied community, the chorus of wronged neighbors, provided the collective weight needed to turn a personal dispute into a criminal conspiracy case. Their combined testimonies showed a pattern of abuse that was impossible to ignore. Without Mr. Henderson's warning, Alexander might have been too patient. Without Miller's investigation, the case would have been weaker. And without the community's support, it would have been just one man's word against a manipulative woman's. Together, they formed an unbreakable chain of justice that ensnared the local tyrant and set their entire neighborhood free. The pacing of the conflict followed a classic arc of rhythmic escalation. It began with the measured, peaceful pace of Alexander's contented life, a baseline of tranquility that made the subsequent disruption all the more jarring. The first police call was a sharp accelerant, quickening the tempo. Then, with each new, absurd complaint, the pace picked up, the rhythm of harassment becoming faster and more frantic, mirroring the rising tension in Alexander's family. The discovery of the financial fraud kicked the narrative into an even higher gear, transforming the story from a drama into a thriller. The planning of the sting operation was a period of tense, controlled speed, a methodical build-up to the finale. The climax itself was a rapid-fire sequence of events. The call, the police arrival, the confrontation, the reveal, and the arrest all happened in a breathless rush. Finally, the epilogue brought a welcome decrescendo, the pace slowing to a gentle, satisfying adagio, allowing for a detailed exploration of the restored peace and the long-term positive changes in the community. This carefully controlled rhythm is what made the final victory feel so profoundly earned and deeply satisfying. It was a masterfully conducted symphony of suburban justice. The humor in the story, though sparse, was a critical element, derived almost entirely from the deep, abiding irony of Karina's situation. There was a sarcastic humor in the sheer absurdity of her complaints, the noxious barbecue fumes, the blinding fairy lights. Her pomposity and bureaucratic jargon were so over the top that they bordered on self-parody. The ultimate source of humor, however, was her complete lack of self-awareness. She was a meticulous planner of her downfall. Every tool she used to harass Alexander, the HOA bylaws, the 911 system, her obsessive vigilance became an instrument of her prosecution. The very fence she tried to force him to build with her own company became a cornerstone of the fraud case against her. The final 911 call, intended to be her crowning achievement of humiliation against him, was instead a recorded confession to a felony. The humor wasn't about laugh-out-loud moments. It was the grimly satisfying intellectual chuckle that comes from watching a villain, blinded by her arrogance, walk step by step into a trap of her own making. It was the comedy of a fool being undone by her foolishness, and it made her defeat all the more complete. The dialogue in the narrative served as a clear window into the characters' souls. Alexander's spoken words were few but impactful. He was a man of action and observation, and when he did speak, his words were direct, factual, and grounded in a clear moral framework. "I understand, officers. You're just doing your job," he would say, showing respect for the system. "We have all the proof in the world," he stated at the climax, a simple declaration of an undeniable truth. His true dialogue was often with himself, his internal thoughts revealing the strategic mind at work beneath the calm exterior. In stark contrast, Karina's dialogue was a weapon. It was filled with condescending, patronizing language. "You must be so careful with the noise levels," veiled threats, and bureaucratic jargon designed to intimidate and confuse. "As per Bylaw 7.4c, your property is not in compliance," she would declare, using rules as a bludgeon. Her words were a performance of superiority, a constant effort to assert a dominance she felt she deserved. The stark difference in their speaking styles highlighted the core conflict. The battle between Alexander's quiet, fact-based reality and Karina's loud, fabricated narrative of grievance and entitlement. The narrative structure was deliberately cinematic, designed to maximize engagement and emotional impact. It began with the in media res hook of the climax, the flashing lights, the handcuffs, the moment of downfall. This immediately established the stakes and promised a satisfying conclusion, hooking the audience with the question, how did it get to this point? Then, the rewind to 6 months earlier allowed the story to breathe, to build the world, and establish the initial state of peace, making the subsequent conflict more impactful. The story then unfolded like a mystery, with Alexander as the detective, uncovering clues, Mr. Henderson's warning, the pattern of police calls, and the financial documents. Each discovery was a piece of a larger puzzle, revealing that this was not just a case of a difficult neighbor but a complex criminal conspiracy. This structure created suspense and propelled the narrative forward, making the audience an active participant in the investigation. The final, planned confrontation was the payoff for all the meticulous build-up, and the detailed epilogue provided a sense of complete and lasting resolution, showing not just that the villain was defeated, but that the community was healed and made stronger, delivering a truly inspirational and cathartic conclusion. The emotional arc of the story was a classic vindication journey. It began in a state of contentment, with Alexander enjoying the simple, earned pleasures of his life and home. This was deliberately shattered by Karina's arrival, plunging the narrative into a state of righteous indignation and rising tension. The constant harassment created a palpable sense of stress, not just for Alexander, but for his entire family. As Alexander shifted from a defensive posture to an offensive one, the emotional tone changed to one of methodical determination. The anger was channeled, focused, and transformed into a cold, calculated strategy. The climax was a moment of pure, triumphant justice, a cathartic release of all the pent-up frustration and anger. The audience, having been on the journey with Alexander, felt the same sense of elation and relief. The story then concluded with an uplifting sense of community restoration and hard-won peace. This emotional progression, from peace to turmoil and back to a deeper, more meaningful peace, is what made the narrative so compelling. It was not just a revenge story, it was a story about restoring balance and harmony to a world thrown into chaos by a single, malicious actor. The point of view, a close third-person narrative focused primarily on Alexander, allowed the audience to experience the story through the eyes of the protagonist, while still maintaining a degree of cinematic objectivity. We were privy to Alexander's internal struggles, his initial desire for peace clashing with his growing need for justice. We felt his frustration as the police calls mounted and saw the strategic gears turning in his mind as he formulated his plan. This created a deep sense of empathy and investment in his cause. Occasionally, the narrative would pull back to show Karina's perspective, but only to highlight her arrogance, her miscalculations, and the smug satisfaction she felt before her fall. This technique made her downfall even more impactful, as the audience knew she was completely unaware of the intricate trap being laid for her. By primarily sticking with Alexander, the story felt personal and grounded, while the brief glimpses into Karina's mind served to emphasize her role as the architect of her destruction, reinforcing the story's central theme of ironic, self-inflicted justice. It was a narrative choice that perfectly served the David versus Goliath theme. Even when David held a position of significant power, the language style of the narration was a carefully crafted hybrid. It blended simple, direct, blue-collar philosopher sentences with more evocative, descriptive passages. When describing action or strategy, the prose was lean and functional. He began to map out a strategy, a chess game where every move was calculated. This reflected Alexander's practical, no-nonsense mindset. However, when describing his home, his family, or the emotional impact of the conflict, the language became more sensory and descriptive. The pool was a cool, blue oasis. The soundtrack of their lives was the splash of a cannonball and the squeals of childish laughter. This contrast created a dynamic reading experience, mirroring the two sides of the protagonist, the family man and the strategic commissioner. Rhetorical questions were used frequently to directly engage the reader, pulling them into Alexander's decision-making process. Have you ever been pushed so far that the only path forward was one of absolute, meticulous, and righteous retribution? This street-smart, conversational yet evocative style made the story feel both epic and relatable. A grand suburban battle told by a wise and weary friend. Visual and sensory cues were woven throughout the fabric of the script, designed to create an immersive, almost cinematic experience for the listener. The narrative didn't just say it was a hot day, it described the sweltering Saturday afternoon, the air thick with the smell of chlorine and freshly cut grass. It didn't just say Karina was unpleasant, it detailed her sterile, floral perfume, her severe haircut, and the aggressive points of her designer shoes. Key sounds were emphasized: the metallic click of the handcuffs, the professional chirp of a police radio, the gentle lapping of the pool's filter. These sensory details served as implicit prompts for the audience's imagination, allowing them to see, hear, and even smell the world of the story. The explicit pacing cues, the short and long pauses, were the final layer, dictating the rhythm of the vocal delivery. They functioned like a film editor's cuts, forcing a moment of reflection after a key revelation or building tension before a dramatic confrontation. This combination of rich sensory language and deliberate pacing transformed the script from a simple block of text into a blueprint for a compelling auditory and visual performance. The narrative was rich with common literary devices that added depth and texture to the story. The central analogy was that of a war or a chess game, with Alexander as the patient, strategically planning his campaign. This metaphor elevated the suburban squabble into an epic conflict of wills. Repetition was used to great effect in describing Karina's predictable pattern of abuse. The endless, absurd 911 calls created a rhythm of harassment that built tension and made the final confrontation all the more necessary. Irony was the story's lifeblood, with nearly every action Karina took contributing directly to her downfall. Mr. Henderson's early conversation served as clear foreshadowing, a warning of the campaign to come. Suspense was meticulously built through the gradual uncovering of her larger criminal plot, turning a simple story of a bad neighbor into a compelling mystery. Finally, the promise of future stories and the direct engagement with the audience served as an open loop, a classic storyteller's technique to ensure the audience returns for the next installment. These devices worked in concert to create a narrative that was not just satisfying but also clever, layered, and memorable. The direct, book-ended address to the audience was a crucial framing device that transformed a third-person narrative into a shared experience. The script began with the narrator stepping out from behind the curtain, speaking directly to the viewer in a casual, conversational tone. The opening hook: "Have you ever been pushed so far? Let me know in the comments where you're watching from." immediately established a personal connection, inviting the audience to see themselves in the story. It positioned the narrator as a fellow traveler, a storyteller sharing a particularly juicy piece of gossip or a cautionary tale around a digital campfire. After this direct address, the narrator seamlessly transitioned into the main story, becoming an omniscient but character-focused storyteller. For 50 parts, the audience was immersed in the world of Maple Drive. Then, at the very end, the narrator would re-emerge for the outro, breaking the fourth wall, once again to wrap things up and make the call to action. This structure created a sense of intimacy and community, making the audience feel less like passive viewers and more like active participants in a shared storytelling tradition, perfectly aligning with the YouTube storyteller style. The story of Alexander and Karina is, at its heart, an inspirational justice narrative that taps into a deeply resonant David versus Goliath fantasy. Alexander, despite his professional title, represents the everyman, a homeowner who simply wants to live in peace. Karina is the ultimate Goliath, not of physical size, but of bureaucratic power and sheer, unadulterated entitlement. The conflict plays out like a suburban true crime story, with a meticulous investigation leading to a dramatic, satisfying arrest. The vindictive tone is carefully managed. It's not about cruel revenge, but about the righteous application of consequences. The satisfaction comes from seeing the intricate system of rules that Karina used as a weapon be turned against her with perfect, inescapable logic. The story is motivational, inspiring listeners to believe that even the most entrenched and infuriating bullies are not invincible. It reassures us that with patience, intelligence, and the courage to stand up for oneself, it is possible to restore justice and reclaim one's peace. It's a story that says, no matter how powerful a Karen may seem, her power is nothing compared to a good person who has finally had enough. Let me tell you, when those handcuffs clicked on Karina's wrists, it was like the whole neighborhood could finally take a deep breath. A story like this isn't just about a bad neighbor, it's about taking back the peace you've worked your entire life to build. Every single one of us has a line, and when someone crosses it, you find out what you're made of. Let me know down in the comments where you're watching from today. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories about justice being served. Because the world is full of Karens, and every single one of them has a reckoning coming.